You could tell from the car door, not the front door, the car door, out in the driveway, 30 seconds before anyone came in. Something in how hard it shut told you which version of the evening you were about to get, and by the time the key turned in the lock, you had already put yourself somewhere useful. Quiet in your room, cheerful at the table, helping with something so you'd be visibly not a problem. Nobody taught you that. You worked it out, the way anyone works out a system they have to live inside. There's a name for the kind of house that produces this. A clinical psychologist in California named Kim Sage started calling it eggshell parenting a couple of years ago, and the phrase caught on fast, which usually means it names something a lot of people already had and couldn't point at. It comes from walking on eggshells. What it describes isn't a cruel parent necessarily. It's an unpredictable one. Warm on Tuesday, cold on Wednesday, and no way to tell in advance which one is coming through the door. That last part is the whole thing, not the anger, the not knowing. And it's worth saying plainly, because a lot of people get stuck here. These are usually not monsters. That's what makes it so hard to describe to anyone. An eggshell parent is often generous, often funny, sometimes the most fun person in the house. They show up to things. They tell people they love you, and they mean it. Then something lands wrong on a Thursday, and the temperature drops 40 degrees for reasons nobody can reconstruct afterwards, including them. The good days are real. That's precisely the problem. If the bad days were the only days, a child could simply brace and stay braced. The good days are what keep the radar switched on, because they're proof that the warm version exists and might be findable if you just read the situation correctly enough. Psychologists have known for a long time that unpredictable outcomes produce stickier behavior than consistent ones. A reward you get every time is easy to take or leave. A reward you get sometimes, on a schedule you can't crack, is the one you'll keep pulling the lever for. Affection works the same way. A child in an eggshell house isn't just avoiding the bad version of their parent, they're running an experiment every single day, trying to find the input that reliably produces the warm one. They never find it, because there isn't one, but they get extremely good at looking. Here's why that distinction matters, and it's where the research gets genuinely interesting. In the early 2000s, a psychologist named Seth Pollak ran a set of experiments at the University of Wisconsin with children aged roughly 8 to 10. Some had grown up with physical abuse at home, some hadn't. He showed them faces, and then he made the task harder on purpose. He blurred the images, stripped out visual detail, showed faces slowly morphing from one emotion into another, and asked the children to say when they saw it change. The children from volatile homes didn't do worse. They did better, on anger, specifically. They picked out angry faces from far less visual information than the other children needed. They caught the shift earlier in the morph, while the face was still mostly neutral. Their brains produced a bigger electrical response to it, and once they'd locked onto anger, they held on longer, still oriented to it, after the other children had moved on. So their perception wasn't damaged, it was tuned. A detector, calibrated by years of practice, on exactly the signal that mattered most. Because think about what the child is actually solving for. Something bad happens here sometimes. I can't control when, but if I can see it coming even a few seconds early, I can change the room. Get quiet, get funny, get scarce. A few seconds is enormous when you're 7. So the system does the sensible thing and lowers its threshold, treating maybes as probablys, because in that house, a missed warning costs far more than a false alarm. And a lowered threshold doesn't come with an off switch. It has no way of knowing the house has changed. So, 7 signs it's still running. 1. You read tone before you hear words. Someone says, "Sure, that's fine," and you don't process the sentence at all. You process the quarter-second pause in front of it, and you already know it isn't fine. 2. You scan on entry. You walk into a room and, without deciding to, you've clocked who's tense, who's been drinking, who isn't speaking to whom. Other people walk into the same room and see a party. 3. Their mood lands in your body before you have a word for it. Not, "I think she's annoyed." A tightness in your chest that arrives first and gets its label second. 4. You are calmest when things are genuinely bad. In a real crisis, you're the most useful person in the room, because a crisis is finally the situation your system was built for. It's the ordinary Tuesday that's hard. 5. You apologize into silence. A conversation goes quiet, and something in you decides the silence is about you, so you fill it, or fix it. or say sorry for a thing nobody was upset about. 6. You're still checking one particular face. Almost everyone with this pattern is scanning for a specific person's weather, usually someone they haven't lived with in 20 years. You'll notice it if you look. The same alertness, aimed at a colleague, a partner, a friend who has never once behaved like that person did. 7. You're tired in a way that doesn't match your day. On paper you did very little. Off paper you monitored a room for 6 hours. That work is invisible, including to you, which is why the exhaustion always feels unearned. Now, a caution, because there's a version of this idea that goes wrong, and I'd rather say it than flatter you. This does not mean your reads are always right. That's the trap. The system genuinely is faster than other people's at catching the signal it was trained on, and it is also biased toward finding that signal, including when it isn't there. Pollak's children weren't better at faces in general. They were better at anger, and slower to let it go. A detector tuned that finally produces false positives. Someone is tired, and you read rejection. Someone is thinking, and you read disapproval. You have a real skill and an unreliable narrator in the same nervous system at the same time. Holding both of those at once is most of the work. 5 small places to start, and none of them are stop being so sensitive, because that has never once worked on a human being. First, name the gap, out loud, to yourself while it's happening. My body says something is wrong. I don't have evidence yet. You're not arguing with the signal and you're not obeying it. You're marking it unconfirmed. It sounds far too small to matter, and it does more than the other 4 combined, because it puts half a second between detection and reaction, and everything you want lives in that half second. Second, ask once, plainly. You've gone quiet. Is that about me or about your day? One question, answered in 4 words, ends a 40-minute internal investigation. Most people who try this find their read was directionally right and completely wrong about the cause. Third, find out whose weather you're watching for. Naming the original face makes it much easier to notice when you're checking the sky in a room that person has never stood in. Fourth, point the skill somewhere it's wanted. This isn't a thing to delete. People with this system make remarkable nurses, teachers, negotiators, editors, friends. The difference between a burden and a gift is mostly whether you chose where to aim it. Fifth, practice being wrong on purpose, somewhere cheap. Let a slightly odd text sit for an hour without building the theory. You're teaching a very old part of you that a delay is survivable. It won't believe you the first time. The belief comes from repetition, not from argument. One more thing, and then I'll leave you alone. There's a specific grief that tends to show up a few days after someone understands this properly. It's not anger at the parent. It's the recognition that a child had to get that good at reading a face. That the skill you're now trying to turn down was engineered by someone very small, working with no information and no options, who did a genuinely excellent job. You don't owe that child gratitude. You also don't have to be at war with what they built. What you can do is update it. Tell it, slowly and repeatedly, the thing it never got to learn, that this room is not that room, and most of the silences here are just silences. It'll take a while. It has decades of evidence on its side, but it is, and this is the entire point, a system that learns from what actually happens, which means it can learn this too.